This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Initials Only by Katharine Green. Chapter 29. Do You Know My Brother? Her hands were thrust out to repel. Her features were fixed, her beauty something wonderful. Orlando Brotherson, thus met, stared for a moment at the vision before him, then slowly and with effort withdrawing his gaze, he sought the face of Mr. Challoner, with the first sign of open disturbance that gentleman had ever seen in him. "Ah," said he, "my welcome is readily understood. I see you far from home, sir," and with an ironical bow, he turned again to Doris, who had dropped her hands, and in whose cheeks the pallor still lingered in a way to check the easy flow of words with which he might have sought to carry off the situation. "Am I in Oswald Brotherson's house?" he asked. "I was directed here, but possibly there may be some mistake." "It is here he lives," said she, moving back automatically till she stood again by the threshold of the small room in which she had received Mr. Challoner. "Do you wish to see him tonight? If so, I fear it is impossible. He has been very ill, and is not allowed to receive visits from strangers." "I am not a stranger," announced the newcomer, with a smile few could see unmoved. It offered such a contrast to his stern and dominating figure. "I thought I heard some words of recognition, which should prove your knowledge of that fact." She did not answer. Her lips had parted, but her thought, or at least the expression of her thought, hung suspended in the terror of this meeting, for which she was not at all prepared. He seemed to note this terror, whether or not he understood its cause, and smiled again, as he added, "Mr. Brotherson must have spoken of his brother Orlando. I am he, Miss Scott. Will you let me come in now?" Her eyes sought those of Mr. Challoner, who quietly nodded. Immediately she stepped from before the door, which her figure had guarded, and motioning him to enter, she begged Mr. Challoner with an imploring look to sustain her in the interview she saw before her. He had no desire for this encounter, especially as Mr. Brotherson's glance in his direction had been anything but conciliatory. He was quite convinced that nothing was to be gained by it, but he could not resist her appeal, and followed them into the little room, whose limited dimensions made the tall Orlando look bigger and stronger and more lordly in his self-confidence than ever. "I am sorry it is so late," she began, contemplating his intrusive figure with forced composure. "We have to be very quiet in the evenings so as not to disturb your brother's first sleep, which is of great importance to him." "Then I'm not to see him tonight?" "I pray you to wait. He's been a very sick man." "Dangerously so?" "Yes." Orlando continued to regard her with a peculiar awakening gaze, showing, Mr. Challoner thought, more interest in her than in his brother, and when he spoke it was mechanically, and as if in sole obedience to the proprieties of the occasion. "I did not know he was ill till very lately. His last letter was a cheerful one, and I supposed that all was right till chance revealed the truth. I came at once. I was intending to come anyway. I have business here, as you probably know, Miss Scott." She shook her head. "I know very little about business," said she. "My brother has not told you why he expected me?" "He has not even told me that he expected you." "No?" The word was highly expressive. There was surprise in it, and a touch of wonder, but more than all, satisfaction. "Oswald was always close-mouthed," he declared, "and it's a good fault. I'm obliged to the boy." These last words were uttered with lightness, which imposed upon his two highly agitated hearers, causing Mr. Challoner to frown and Doris to shrink back in indignation at the man who could indulge in a sportive suggestion in the presence of such fears, if not of such memories, as the situation evoked. But to one who knew this strong and self-contained man, to Sweetwater possibly, had he been present, there was in this very attempt, in his quiet manner, and in this strange and fitful flash of his ordinarily quick eye, that which showed he was laboring, and had been laboring almost from his first entrance, under an excitement of thought and feeling which one of his powerfully organized nature must end, and that soon in an outburst of mysterious passion which could carry everything before it. But he did not mean that it should happen here. He was too accustomed to self-command to forget himself in their presence. He would hold these rampant dogs in leash till the hour of solitude. Then a glittering smile twisted his lips, and he continued to gaze, first at the girl who had just entered his life, and then at the man he had every reason to distrust. and with that firm restraint upon himself still in force, remarked with a courteous inclination, "The hour is late for further conversation. I have a room at the hotel, and will return to it at once. In the morning I hope to see my brother." He was going, Doris not knowing what to say, Mr. Challoner not desirous of detaining him, when there came a sound of a little tinkle from the other side of the hall, blanching the young girl's cheeks, and causing Orlando Brotherson's brows to rise in peculiar satisfaction. "My brother?" he asked. "Yes," came in flattering reply. "He has heard our voices. I must go to him." "Say that Orlando wishes him a good night," smiled her heart's enemy, with a bow of infinite grace. She shuddered, and was hastening from the room when her glance fell on Mr. Challoner. He was pale, and looked greatly disturbed. The prospect of being left alone with a man whom she had herself denounced to him as his daughter's murderer might prove a tax to his strength, to which she had no right to subject him. Pausing with an appealing air, she made him a side gesture, which he at once understood. "I will accompany you into the hall," said he. "Then if anything is wrong, you have but to speak my name." But Orlando Brotherson, displeased by this move, took a step which brought him between the two. "You can hear her from here, if she chooses to speak. There is a point to be settled between us before either of us leave this house, and this opportunity is as good as another. Go to my brother, Miss Scott. We will await your return." Flashed from the proud banker's eye, but no demur, rather a gesture of consent. Doris, with a look of anxiety, sped away, and the two men stood face to face. It was one of those moments which men recognize as memorable. What had the one to say, or the other to hear, worthy of this permeable and the more than doubtful relation in which they stood each to each? Mr. Challoner had more time than he expected in which to wonder and grit himself for whatever suffering of shock awaited him, for Orlando Brotherson, unlike his usual self, kept himself awaiting, while he collected his own wits, which, strange to say, seemed to have vanished with the girl. The question came, "Mr. Challoner, do you know my brother? Do you know him? Does he know you?" "Not at all. We're strangers." It was said honestly. They did not know each other. Mr. Challoner was quite correct in his statement. But the other had his doubts. Why shouldn't he have? The coincidence of finding this mourner, if not avenger, of Edith Challoner, in his own direct radius again, at a spot so distant, so obscure, and so disconnected with any apparent business reason, was certainly startling enough unless the tie could be found in his brother's name and close relationship to him. He therefore allowed himself to press the question. Men sometimes correspond who do not know each other. "You knew that a Brotherson lived here?" "Yes." "And hoped to learn something about me?" "No. My interest was solely with your brother." "With my brother? With Oswald? What interest can you have in him apart from me?" "Oswald is—" Suddenly a thought, name, an unimaginable one with power to blanch even his hardy cheek and shake a soul unassailable by all small emotions. "Oswald Brotherson?" he repeated, adding an unintelligible to himself. "O.B. The same initials. They are following up these initials. Poor Oswald." Then aloud, "It hardly becomes me, perhaps, to question your motives in this attempt at making my brother's acquaintance. I think I can guess them, but your labor will be wasted. Oswald's interests do not extend beyond this town. They hardly extend to me. We are strangers, almost. You will learn nothing from him on the subject which naturally engrosses you." Mr. Challoner simply bowed. "I do not feel called upon," said he, "to explain my reasons for wishing to know your brother. I will simply satisfy you upon a point which may well rouse your curiosity. You remember that my daughter's last act was the writing of a letter to a little protégé of hers. Miss Scott was that protégé. In seeking her, I came upon him. Do you require me to say more on this subject? Wait till I have seen Mr. Oswald Brotherson, and then perhaps I can do so." Receiving no answer to this, Mr. Challoner turned again to the man who was the object of his deepest suspicions, to find him still in the daze of this unimaginable thought, battling with it, scoffing at it, succumbing to it. and all without a word. Mr. Challoner was without clue to this struggle, but the might of it and the mystery of it drew agitation from the room. Though proof was lacking, though proof might never come, nothing could ever alter his belief from this moment on that Doris was right in her estimate of this man's guilt, however substantial her reasoning might appear. How far he might have been carried by this new conviction, whether he would have left the house without seeing Doris again, or exchanging another word with the man whose very presence stifled him, he had no opportunity to show, for before he had taken another step, he encountered the hurrying figure of Doris, who was returning to her guests with an air of marked relief. "He does not know that you are here," she whispered to Mr. Challoner as she passed him. Then, as she again comforted Orlando, who hastened to dismiss his trouble at her approach, she said quite gaily, "Mr. Brotherson heard your voice, and is glad to know that you are here. He bade me give you this key and say that you would have found things in better shape if he had been in condition to superintend the removal of the boxes to the place he had prepared for you before he became ill. I was the one to do that," she added, controlling her aversion with manifest effort. When Mr. Brotherson came to himself, he asked if I had heard about any large boxes having arrived at the station shipped to his name. I said that several notices of such had come to the house, at which he requested me to see that they were carried at once to the strange-look shed he had put up for him in the woods. I thought that they were for him, and I saw to the things myself. 2 or 3 others have come since and have been taken to the same place. I think you will find nothing broken or disturbed. Mr. Brotherson's wishes are usually respected." "That is fortunate for me," was the courteous reply, but Orlando Brotherson was not himself, not at all himself, as he bowed a formal adieu, and passed the drawn-up sentinel-like figure of Mr. Challoner, without a motion on his part, or on the part of that gentleman to lighten an exit which had something in it of doom and dread presage. End of chapter 29.
Of Initials Only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Initials Only by Anna Katharine Green. Book 3. The Heart of Man. Chapter 30. Chaos. It is not difficult to understand Mr. Challoner's feelings, or even those of Doris, at the moment of Mr. Brotherson's departure. But why this change in Brotherson himself? Why this sense of something new and terrible rising between him and the suddenly beclouded future? Let us follow him to his lonely hotel room and see if we can solve the puzzle. But first, does he understand his own trouble? He does not seem to, for when, his hat thrown aside, he stops, erect and frowning under the flaring gas-jet he had no recollection of lighting, his first act was to lift his hand to his head in a gesture of surprising helplessness for him, while snatches of broken sentences fell from his lips, among which could be heard, "What has come to me? Undone in an hour, doubly undone. First by a face, and then by this thought which surely the devils have whispered to me. Mr. Challoner and Oswald. What is the link between them? Great God, what is the link? Not myself. Who then, or what?" Flinging himself into a chair, he buried his face in his hands. There were 2 demons to fight. The first in the guise of an angel. Doris. Unknown yesterday, unknown an hour ago, but now... Had there ever been a day, an hour, where she had not been as the very throb of his heart, the light of his eyes, and the crown of all imaginable blisses? He was startled at his own emotion as he contemplated her image in his fancy and listened for the lost echo of the few words she had spoken. Words so full of music when they referred to his brother, so hard and cold when she simply addressed himself. This was no passing admiration of youth for a captivating woman. This was not even the love he had given to Edith Challoner. This was something springing full-born out of nothing, a force which, for the first time in his life, made him complacent to the natural weaknesses of man. A dream and yet a reality strong enough to blot out the past, remake the present, change the aspect of all his hopes, and outline a new fate. He did not know himself. There was nothing in his whole history to give him an understanding of such feelings as these. Can a man be seized, as it were, by the hair, and swung up on the slopes of paradise or down the steeps of hell, without a forewarning, without the chance even to say whether he wished such a cataclysm in his life or no? He, Orlando Brotherson, had never thought much of love. Science had been his mistress, ambition his lodestar. Such feeling as he had acknowledged to had been for men, struggling men, men who were downtrodden and gasping in the narrow bounds of poverty and helplessness. Miss Challoner had roused, his pride. He could see that now. The might of this new emotion made plain many things he had passed by as useless, puerile, unworthy of a man of mental calibre and might. He had never loved Edith Challoner at any moment of their acquaintanceship, though he had been sincere in thinking that he did. Doris's beauty, the hour he had just passed with her, had undeceived him. Did he hail the experience? It was not likely to bring him joy. This young girl, whose image floated in light before his eyes, would never love him. She loved his brother. He had heard their names mentioned together before he had even been in town an hour. Oswald, the cleverest man; Doris, the most beautiful girl in western Pennsylvania. He had accepted the gossip then. He had not seen her, and it all seemed very natural, hardly worth a moment's thought. But now... And here the other demon sprang erect and grappled with him before the first one had let go his hold. Oswald and Challoner! The secret, unknown something which had softened that hard man's eye when his brother's name was mentioned. He had noted it and realized the mystery, a mystery before which sleep and rest must fly, a mystery to which he must now give his thought, whatever the cost, whatever the loss to those heavenly dreams the magic of which was so new it seemed to envelope him in the balm of paradise. Away then, image of light! Let the faculties thou hast days act again. There is more than fate's caprice in Challoner's interest in a man he never saw. Ghosts of old memories rise and demand a hearing. Facts, trivial and commonplace enough to have been lost in oblivion with the day which gave them birth, throng again from the past, proving that naught dies without a possibility of resurrection. Their power over this brooding man is shown by the force with which his fingers crush against his bowed forehead. Oswald and Challoner! Had he found the connecting link? Had it been? Could it have been Edith? The preposterous is sometimes true. Could it be true in this case? He recalled the letters read to him as hers in that room of his in Brooklyn. He had hardly noted them then, he was so sure of their being forgeries gotten up by the police to mislead him. Could they have been real, the effusions of her mind, the breathings of her heart, directed to an actual O.B., and that O.B. his brother? They had not been meant for him. He had read enough of the mawkish lines to be sure of that. None of the allusions fitted in with the facts of their mutual intercourse. But they might with those of another man. They might with the possible acts and affections of Oswald, whose temperament was wholly different from his, and who might have loved her, should it ever be shown that they had met and known each other. And this was not an impossibility. Oswald had been east. Oswald had even been in the Berkshires before himself. Oswald... Why, it was Oswald who had suggested that he should go there. Go where she still was. Why this second coincidence if there were no tie, if the Challoners and Oswald were as far apart as they seemed, and as conventionalities would naturally place them? Oswald was a sentimentalist, but very reserved about his sentimentalities. If these suppositions were true, he had had a sentimentalist's motive for what he did. As Orlando realized this, he rose from his seat, aghast at the possibilities confronting him from this line of thought. Should he contemplate them? Risk his reason by dwelling on a supposition which might have no foundation in fact? No, his brain was too full, his purposes too important for any unnecessary strain to be put upon his faculties. No thinking. Investigation first. Mr. Challoner should be able to settle this question. He would see him. Even at this late hour he ought to be able to find him in one of the rooms below, and, by the force of an irresistible demand, learn in a moment whether he had to do with a mere chimera of his own overwrought fancy, or with a fact which would call into play all the resources of a hitherto unconquered and undaunted nature. There was a wood fire burning in the sitting-room that night, and around it was grouped a number of men with their papers and pipes. Mr. Brotherson, entering, naturally looked that way for the man he was in search of, and was disappointed not to find him there, but on casting his glances elsewhere, he was relieved to see him standing in one of the windows overlooking the street. His back was to the room, and he seemed to be lost in a fit of abstraction. As Orlando crossed to him, he had time to observe how much whiter was this man's head than in the last interview he had held with him in the coroner's office in New York. But this evidence of grief in one with whom he had little, if anything, in common, neither touched his feelings nor deterred his step. The awakening of his heart to new and profound emotions had not softened him towards the sufferings of others, if those others stood without the pale he had previously raised as the legitimate boundary of a just man's sympathies. He was, as I have said, an extraordinary specimen of manly vigour in body and in mind, and his presence in any company always attracted attention and roused, if it never satisfied, curiosity. Conversation accordingly ceased as he strode up to Mr. Challoner's side, so that his words were quite audible as he addressed that gentleman with a somewhat curt, "You see me again, Mr. Challoner. May I beg of you a few minutes' further conversation? I will not detain you long." The grey head turned, and the many eyes watching showed surprise at the expression of dislike and repulsion with which this New York gentleman met the request thus emphatically urged. But his answer was courteous enough. If Mr. Brotherson knew a place where they would be left undisturbed, he would listen to him, if he would be very brief. For reply, the other pointed to a small room quite unoccupied, which opened out of the one in which they then stood. Mr. Challoner bowed, and in another moment the door closed upon them, to the infinite disappointment of the men about the hearth. "What do you wish to ask?" was Mr. Challoner's immediate inquiry. "This. I make no apologies, and expect in answer nothing more than an unequivocal yes or no. You tell me that you have never met my brother. Can that be said of the other members of your family? Of your deceased daughter, in fact?" "No." "She was acquainted with Oswald Brotherson?" "She was." "Without your knowledge?" "Entirely so." "Corresponded with him?" "Not exactly." "How, not exactly?" "He wrote to her, occasionally. She wrote to him frequently, but she never sent her letters." "Ah!" The exclamation was sharp, short, and conveyed little. Yet with its escape, the whole scaffolding of this man's hold upon life and his own fate went down in indistinguishable chaos. Mr. Challoner realized a sense of havoc, though the eyes bent upon his countenance had not wavered, nor the stalwart figure moved. "I have read some of those letters," the inventor finally acknowledged. "The police took great pains to place them under my eye, supposing them to have been meant for me because of the initials written on the wrapper. But they were meant for Oswald. You believe that now?" "I know it." "And that is why I found you in the same house with him?" "It is. Providence has robbed me of my daughter. If this brother of yours should prove to be the man I am led to expect, I shall ask him to take that place in my heart and life which was once hers." A quick recoil, a smothered exclamation on the part of the man he addressed. A barb had been hidden in this simple statement, which had reached some deeply hidden but vulnerable spot in Brotherson's breast, which had never been pierced before. His eye, which alone seemed alive, still rested piercingly upon that of Mr. Challoner, but its light was fast fading, and speedily became lost in a dimness in which the other seemed to see extinguished the last upflaring embers of those inner fires which feed the aspiring soul. It was a sight no man could see unmoved. Mr. Challoner turned sharply away, in dread of the abyss which the next word he uttered might open between them. But Orlando Brotherson possessed resources of strength of which, possibly, he was not aware himself. When Mr. Challoner, still more affected by the silence than by the dread I have mentioned, turned to confront him again, it was to find his features composed and his glance clear. He had conquered all outward manifestation of the mysterious emotion which for an instant had laid his proud spirit low. "You are considerate of my brother," were the words with which he reopened this painful conversation. "You will not find your confidence misplaced. Oswald is a straightforward fellow of few faults." "I believe it. No man can be so universally beloved without some very substantial claims to regard. I am glad to see that your opinion, though given somewhat coldly, coincides with that of his friends." "I am not given to exaggeration," was the even reply. The flush which had come into Mr. Challoner's cheek under the effort he had made to sustain with unflinching heroism this interview with the man he looked upon as his mortal enemy, slowly faded out till he looked the wraith of himself even to the unsympathetic eyes of Orlando Brotherson. A duty lay before him which would tax to its utmost extent his already greatly weakened self-control. Nothing which had yet passed showed that this man realized the fact that Oswald had been kept in ignorance of Miss Challoner's death. If these brothers were to meet on the morrow, it must be with the full understanding that this especial topic was to be completely avoided. But in what words could he urge such a request upon this man? None suggested themselves, yet he had promised Miss Scott that he would ensure his silence in this regard, and it was with this difficulty and no other he had been struggling when Mr. Brotherson came upon him in the other room. "You still have something to say?" suggested the latter, as an oppressive silence swallowed up that icy sentence I have already recorded. "I have," returned Mr. Challoner, regaining his courage under the exigencies of the moment. "Miss Scott is very anxious to have your promise that you will avoid all disagreeable topics with your brother till the doctor pronounces him strong enough to meet the trouble which awaits him." "You mean he is not as unhappy as we?" "He knows nothing of the affliction which has befallen him. He was taken ill—" The rest was almost inaudible. But Orlando Brotherson had no difficulty in understanding him, and for the second time in this extraordinary interview he gave evidences of agitation and of a mind shaken from its equipoise. But only for an instant. He did not shun the other's gaze or even maintain more than a momentary silence. Indeed, he found strength to smile, in a curious, sardonic way, as he said, "Do you think I should be apt to broach this subject with anyone, let alone with him, whose connection with it I shall need days to realize? I am not so given to gossip, Besides, he and I have other topics of interest. I have an invention ready with which I propose to experiment in a place he has already prepared for me. We can talk about that." The irony, the hardy self-possession with which this was said, struck Mr. Challoner to the heart. Without a word he wheeled about towards the door. Without a word Brotherson stood, watching him go till he saw his hand fall on the knob, when he quietly prevented his exit by saying, "Unhappy truths cannot be long concealed. How soon does the doctor think my brother can bear these inevitable revelations? He said this morning that if his patient were as well tomorrow as his present condition gives promise of, he might be told in another week." Orlando bowed his appreciation of this fact, but added quickly, "Who is to do the telling?" "Doris. Nobody else could be trusted with so delicate a task." "I wish to be present." Mr. Challoner looked up, surprised at the feeling with which this request was charged. "As his brother, his only remaining relative, I have that right. Do you think that Miss Scott can be trusted not to forestall that moment by any previous hint of what awaits him?" "If she so promises." "But will you exact this from her? It surely cannot be necessary for me to say that your presence will add infinitely to the difficulty of her task." "Yet it is a duty I cannot shirk. I will consult the doctor about it. I will make him see that I both understand and shall insist upon my rights in this matter. But you may tell Miss Doris that I will sit out of sight, and that I shall not obtrude myself unless my name is brought up in an undesirable way." The hand on the doorknob made a sudden movement. "Mr. Brotherson, I can bear no more tonight. With your permission, I will leave this question to be settled by others." And with a repetition of his former bow, the bereaved father withdrew. Orlando watched him until the door closed. Then he too dropped his mask. But it was on again when, in a little while, he passed through the sitting-room on his way upstairs. No other day in his whole life had been like this to the hardy inventor, for in it both his heart and his conscience had been awakened, and up to this hour he had not really known that he possessed either. End of chapter 30.
Of Initials Only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Baron Young. Initials Only by Katharine Green. Book 3, The Heart of Man, Chapter 31. What is he making? A letter boxes addressed to old Brotherson had been received at the station, and carried to a mysterious shed in the woods. And now, with locked door and lifted top, the elder brother contemplated his stores and prepared himself for work. He had been allowed a short interview with Oswald, and he had indulged himself in a few words with Doris. But he had left those memories behind with other and more serious matters. Nothing that could unnerve his hand or weaken his insight should enter the spot sacred to his great hope. Here genius reigned. Here he was himself wholly and without flaw. A Titan with his grasp on the mechanical idea by means of which he would soon rule the world. Not so happy were the other characters in this drama. Oswald's thoughts, disturbed for a short time by the somewhat constrained interview he had held with his brother, had flown eastward again, in silent love and longing, while Doris, with a double dread now in her heart, went about her daily tasks, praying for strength to endure the horrors of this week, without betraying the anxieties secretly devouring her. And she was only 17, and quite alone in her trouble. She was buried all unassisted and small, which she did with heavenly sweetness, when the magic threshold was passed, and she stood in her invalid's presence, overshadowed through it, ever was by the great dread. And Mr. Chanel let those endless walks of his through woods and over the hills tell his story if they can, or his rapidly whitening hair and lagging step. He had been a strong man before his trouble, and had the stroke which laid him low been limited to one quick, sharp blow, he might have risen above it after a while, and been ready to encounter life again. But this long drawn-out misery was proving too much for him. The sight of Peterson, though they never really met, acted like acid upon the wound, and it was not till 6 days had passed and the dreaded Sunday was at hand that he slept with any sense of rest, or went his way about the town without that halting at corners which betrayed the perpetual apprehension of a most undesirable encounter. The reason for this change will be apparent in the short conversation he held with the men he had come upon one evening in a small park just beyond the workmen's dwellings. "You see I'm here," was the stranger's low greeting. "Thank God," was Mrs. Challoner's reply. "I could not have faced tomorrow alone, and I doubt if Miss Scott could have found the requisite courage. Does she know that you are here?" I stopped at her door. "Was that safe?" "I think so. Miss Witherson, the Brooklyn man, is up in his shed. He sleeps there now, I'm told, and soundly too, I've no doubt." "What is he making?" "What half the inventors on both sides of the water are engaged upon just now. A monoplane, or a biplane, or some machine for carrying men through the air. I know, for I helped him with it. But you'll find that if he succeeds in this undertaking, and I believe he will, nothing short of fame awaits him. His invention has starting points, but I'm not going to give them away. I'll be true enough to him for that. As an inventor he has my sympathy, but, well, we'll see what we shall see tomorrow. You say that he is bound to be present when Miss Scott relates her tragic story. He won't be the only unseen listener. I've made my own arrangements with Miss Scott. If he feels the need of watching her and his brother Oswald, I feel the need of watching him. You take a burden of intolerable weight from my shoulders. Now I shall feel easier about that interview. But I should like to ask you this. Do you feel justified in this continued surveillance of a man who has so frequently and with such evident sincerity declared his innocence?" "I do that. If he's as guiltless as he says he is, my watchfulness won't hurt him. If he's not, then, Mr. Challoner, I've but one duty, to match his strength with my patience. That man is one great mystery of the day, and mysteries call for solution. At least, that's the way a detective looks at it. May Heaven help your efforts." "I shall need its assistance," was the dry rejoinder. Sweetwater was by no means blind to the difficulties awaiting him. End of chapter 31.
Chapter 32 of Initials Only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Initials Only by Katharine Green. Book 3. The Heart of Man. Chapter 32. Tell Me, Tell It All. The day was a grey one, the first of the kind in weeks. As Doris stepped into the room where Oswald sat, she felt how much a ray of sunshine would have encouraged her, and yet how truly these leaden skies and this dismal atmosphere expressed the gloom which soon must fall upon this hopeful, smiling man. He smiled because any man must smile at the entrance of so lovely a woman, but it was an abstracted smile, and Doris, seeing it, felt her courage falter for a moment, though her steps did not, nor her steady, compassionate gaze. Advancing slowly and not answering because she did not hear some casual remark of his, she took her stand by his side, and then slowly and with her eyes on his face, sank down upon her knees, still without speaking, almost without breathing. His astonishment was evident, for her air was strange and full of presage, as, indeed, she had meant it to be. But he remained as silent as she, only reached out his emaciated hand and, laying it on her head, smiled again, but this time far from abstractedly. Then, as he saw her cheeks pale in terror for the task before her, he ventured to ask gently, "What is the matter, child? So weary, eh? Nothing worse than that, I hope? Are you quite strong this morning? Strong enough to listen to my troubles? Strong enough to bear your own, if God sees fit to send them?" came hesitantly from her lips, as she watched the effect of each word, in breathless anxiety. "Troubles? There can be but one trouble for me," was his unexpected reply. "That I do not fear, will not fear in my hour of happy recovery. So long as Edith is well, Doris. Doris, you alarm me. Edith is not ill, not ill." The poor child could not answer save with her sympathetic look and halting, tremulous breath, and these signs he would not, could not read. His own words had made such an echo in his ears. "Ill? I cannot imagine Edith ill. I always see her in my thoughts, as I saw her on that day of our first meeting, a perfect, animated woman with the joyous look of a glad, harmonious nature. Nothing has ever clouded that vision. If she were ill, I would have known it. We are so truly one that, Doris, Doris, you do not speak. You know the depth of my love, the terror of my thoughts. Is Edith ill?" The eyes gazing wildly into his, slowly left his face and raised themselves aloft with a sublime look. Would he understand? Yes, he understood, and the cry which rang from his lips stopped for a moment the beating of more than one heart in that little cottage. "Dead!" he shrieked out, and fell back fainting in his chair, his lips still murmuring in semi-unconsciousness, "Dead! Dead!" Doris sprang to her feet, thinking of nothing but his wavering, slipping life till she saw his breath return, his eyes refill with light. Then the horror of what was yet to come, the answer which must be given to the "how" she saw trembling on his lips, caused her to sink again upon her knees in an unconscious appeal for strength. If that one sad revelation had been all. But the rest must be told. His brother exacted it, and so did the situation. Further waiting, further hiding of the truth would be insupportable after this. But oh, the bitterness of it! No wonder that she turned away from those frenzied, wildly demanding eyes. "Doris!" She trembled and looked behind her. She had not recognized his voice. Had another entered? Had his brother dared? No. They were alone, seemingly so, that is. She knew, no one better than that, they were not really alone, that witnesses were within hearing, if not within sight. "Doris!" he urged again, and this time she turned in his direction and gazed aghast. If the voice were strange, what of the face which now confronted her? The ravages of sickness had been marked, but they were nothing to those made in an instant by a blasting grief. She was startled, although expecting much, and could only press his hand while she waited for the question he was gathering strength to utter. It was simple when it came, just two words. "How long?" She answered them as simply. "Just as long as you have been ill," said she. Then, with no attempt to break the inevitable shock, she went on. "Miss Challoner was struck dead, and you were taken down with typhoid on the self same day." "Struck dead? Why do you use that word, struck? Struck dead? She, a young woman?" "Oh, Doris, an accident. My darling has been killed in an accident." "They do not call it accident. They call it what it never was." "What it never was," she insisted, pressing him back with frightened hands, as he strove to rise. "Miss Challoner was—" How nearly the word shot had left her lips. How fiercely above all else in that harrowing moment had risen the desire to fling the accusation of that word into the ears of him who listened from his secret hiding place. But she refrained out of compassion for the man she loved, and declared instead: "Miss Challoner died from a wound. How given, why given, no one knows. I had rather have died myself than have to tell you this. Oh, Mr. Brotherson, speak, sob, do anything but—" She started back, dropping his hands as she did so. With quick intuition she saw that he must be left to himself if he were to meet this blow without succumbing. The body must have freedom if the spirit would not go mad. Conscious, or perhaps not conscious, of his release from her restraining hand, albeit profiting by it, he staggered to his feet, murmuring that word of doom. "Wound! Wound! My darling died of a wound? What kind of a wound?" he suddenly thundered out. "I cannot understand what you mean by wound. Make it clear to me. Make it clear to me at once. If I must bear this grief, let me know its whole depth. Leave nothing to my imagination, or I cannot answer for myself. Tell it all, Doris." And Doris told him. She was on the mezzanine floor of the hotel where she lives. She was seemingly happy, and had been writing a letter to me which they never forwarded. There was no one else by but some strangers, good people whom one must believe. She was crossing the floor when suddenly she threw up her hands and fell. A thin, narrow paper cutter was in her grasp, and it flew into the lobby. Some say she struck herself with that cutter, for when they picked her up they found a wound in her breast which that cutter might have made. "Edith? Never!" The words were chokingly said. He was swaying, almost falling, but he steadied himself. "Who says that?" he asked. It was the coroner's verdict. "And she died that way, died?" "Immediately." "After writing to you?" "Yes." "What was in that letter?" "Nothing of threat, they say, only just cheer and expressions of hope. Just like the others, Mr. Brotherson." "And they accuse her of taking her own life. Their verdict is a lie. They did not know her." Then, after some moments of wild and confused feeling, he declared, with a desperate effort at self-control: "You said that some believe this. Then there must be others who do not. What do they say?" "Nothing. They simply feel as you do. They see no reason for the act and no evidence of her having meditated it. Her father and her friend insist besides that she was incapable of such a horror. The mystery of it is killing us all, me above others, for I've had to show you a cheerful face, with my brain reeling and my heart like lead in my bosom." She held out her hands. She tried to draw his attention to herself, not from any sentiment of egotism, but to break, if she could, the strain of these insupportable horrors, with so short a time before hope sang and life revelled in re-awakened joys. Perhaps some faint realization of this reached him, for presently he caught her by the hands and bowed his head upon her shoulder, and finally let her seat him again, before he said, "Do they know of my interest in this?" "Yes, they know about the two O.B.s." "The two!" He was on his feet again, but only for a moment. His weakness was greater than his will power. "Orlando and Oswald Brotherson," she explained, in answer to his broken appeal. "Your brother wrote letters to her as well as you, and signed them just as you did, with his initials only. These letters were found in his desk, and he was supposed for a time to have been the author of all that were so signed, but they found out the difference after a while. Yours were easily recognised after they learned there was another O.B. who loved her." The words were plain enough, but the stricken listener did not take them in. They carried no meaning to him. How should they? The very idea she sought to impress upon him by this seemingly careless allusion was an incredible one. She found it her dreadful task to tell him the hard, bare truth. "Your brother," said she, "was devoted to Miss Challoner too. He even wanted to marry her. I cannot keep back this fact. It is known everywhere, and by everybody but you." "Orlando!" His lips took an ironical curve as he uttered the word. This was a young girl's imaginative fancy to him. Why, Orlando never knew her, never saw her, never. He met her at Lennox. The name produced its effect. He stared, made an effort to think, repeated Lennox over to himself, then suddenly lost his hold upon the idea which that word suggested, struggled again for it, seized it in an instant of madness, and shouted out, "Yes, yes, I remember. I sent him there," and paused, his mind blank again. Poor Doris, frightened to her very soul, looked blindly about for help, but she did not quit his side. She did not dare to, for his lips had reopened. The continuity of his thoughts had returned. He was going to speak. "I sent him there." The words came in a sort of shout. "I was so hungry to hear of her, and I thought he might mention her in his letter." Insane! Insane! He saw her, and what's that you said about his loving her? He couldn't have loved her. He's not of the loving sort. They've deceived you with strange tales. They've deceived the whole world with fancies and mad dreams. He may have admired her, but loved her? No! Nor, if he had, he would have respected my claims. He did not know them. A laugh which paled Doris's cheek. Then his tones grew even again. Memory came back, and he muttered faintly, "That is true. I said nothing to him. He had the right to court her, and he did. You say, wrote to her, imposed himself upon her, drove her mad with importunities. She was forced to rebuke. And what else? There is something else. Tell me. I will know it all." He was standing now, his feebleness all gone, passion in every lineament, and his eye alive with emotion. "Tell me," he repeated, with unrestrained vehemence. "Tell me all. Kill me with sorrow, but save me from being unjust." He wrote her a letter. It frightened her. He followed it up by a visit. Doris paused. The sentence hung suspended. She had heard a step, a hand on the door. Orlando had entered the room. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Initials Only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Initials Only by Katharine Green. Book 3. The Heart of Man. Chapter 33. Alone. Oswald had heard nothing, seen nothing, but he took note of Doris's silence, and turning towards her in frenzy saw what had happened, and so was in a measure prepared for the stern, short sentence which now rang through the room. "Wait, Miss Scott. You tell the story badly. Let him listen to me. From my mouth only shall he hear the stern and seemingly unnatural part I played in this family tragedy." The face of Oswald hardened. Those pliant features, beloved for their gracious kindliness, set themselves in lines which altered them almost beyond recognition, but his voice was not without some of its natural sweetness, as, after a long and hollow look at the other's composed countenance, he abruptly exclaimed, "Speak! I am bound to listen. You are my brother." Orlando turned towards Doris. She was slipping away. "Don't go," said he, but she was gone. Slowly he turned back. Oswald raised his hand and checked the words with which he would have begun his story. "Never mind the beginnings," said he. "Doris has told all that. You saw Miss Challoner in Lennox, admired her, offered yourself to her, and afterwards wrote her a threatening letter because she rejected you." "It is true. Other men have followed just such unworthy impulses, and been ashamed and sorry afterwards. I was sorry and I was ashamed, and as soon as my first anger was over, went to tell her so, but she mistook my purpose and—" "And what?" Orlando hesitated. Even his iron nature trembled before the misery he saw, a misery he was destined to augment rather than soothe. With pains altogether out of keeping with his character, he sought in the recesses of his darkened mind for words, less bitter and less abrupt than those which sprang involuntarily to his lips. But he did not find them. Though he pitied his brother and wished to show that he did, nothing but the stern language suitable to the stern fact he wished to impart would leave his lips. "And ended the pitiful struggle of the moment with one quick, unpremeditated blow," was what he said. "There is no other explanation possible for this act, Oswald. Bitter as it is for me to acknowledge it, I am thus far guilty of this beloved woman's death, but, as God hears me, from the moment I first saw her to the moment I saw her last, I did not know, nor did I for a moment dream, that she was anything to you or to any other man of my stamp and station. I thought she despised my country birth, my mechanical attempts, my lack of aristocratic pretensions and traditions. Edith! Now that I know she had other reasons for her contempt, that the words she wrote were in rebuke to the brother rather than to the man, I feel my guilt and deplore my anger. I cannot say more. I should but insult your grief by any lengthy expressions of regret and sorrow." A groan of intolerable anguish from the sick man's lips, and then the quick thrust of his reawakened intelligence rising superior to the overthrow of all his hopes. For a woman of Edith's principle to seek death in a moment of desperation, the provocation must have been very great. "Tell me if I'm to hate you through life, yea, through all eternity, or if I must seek in some unimaginable failure of my own character or conduct the cause of her intolerable despair." "Oswald!" The tone was controlling, and yet that of one strong man to another. "Is it for us to read the heart of any woman, least of all of a woman of her susceptibilities and keen inner life? The wish to end all comes to some natures like a lightning flash from a clear sky. It comes, it goes, often without leaving a sign. But if a weapon chances to be near, here it was in hand. Then death follows the impulse which, given an instant of thought, would have vanished in a back sweep of other emotions. Chance was the real accessory to this death by suicide. Oswald, let us realise it is as such, and accept our sorrow as a mutual burden, and turn to what remains to us of life and labour. Work is grief's only consolation, then let us work. But of all this Oswald had caught but the one word. Chance, he repeated. Orlando, I believe in God. Then seek your comfort there. I find it in harnessing the winds, in forcing the powers of nature to do my bidding. The other did not speak, and the silence grew heavy. It was broken, when it was broken, by a cry from Oswald. No more, said he, no more. Then in a yearning accent, send Doris to me. Orlando started. This name coming so close upon that word comfort produced a strange effect upon him. But another look at Oswald, and he was ready to do his bidding. The bitter ordeal was over. Let him have his solace, if it was in her power to give it to him. Orlando, upon leaving his brother's room, did not stop to deliver that brother's message directly to Doris. He left this for Truda to do, and retired immediately to his hangar in the woods. Locking himself in, he slightly raised the roof, and then sat down before the car, which was rapidly taking on shape and assuming that individuality and appearance of sentient life which hitherto he had only seen in dreams. But his eye, which had never failed to kindle at this sight before, shone dully in the semi-gloom. The air car could wait. He would first have his hour in this solitude of his own making. The gaze he dreaded, the words from which he shrank, could not penetrate here. He might even shout her name aloud, and only these windowless walls would respond. He was alone with his past, his present and his future. Alone. He needed to be. The strongest must pause when the precipice yawns before him. The gulf can be spanned. He feels himself forceful enough for that, but his eyes must take their measurement of it first. He must know his depths and possible dangers. Only a fool would ignore these steeps of jagged rock, and he was no fool, only a man to whom the unexpected had happened. A man who had seen his way clear to the horizon, and then had come up against this. Love when he thought such folly dead. Remorse, when glory called for the quiet mind and heart. He recognised its mordant fang, and knew that its ravages, though only just begun, would last his lifetime. Nothing could stop them now. Nothing, nothing. And he laughed as the thought went home, laughed at the irony of fate and its explorerness, laughed at his own defeat and his nearness to a barred paradise. Oswald loved Edith, loved her yet, with a flame time would take long to quench. Doris loved Oswald, and he Doris, and not one of them would ever attain the delights each was so fitted to enjoy. Why shouldn't he laugh? What is left to man but mockery when all props fall? Disappointment was the universal lot, and it should go merrily with him if he must take his turn at it. But here the strong spirit of the man reasserted itself. It should be but a turn. A man's joys are not bounded by his loves, or even by the satisfaction of a perfectly untrammelled mind. Performance makes a world of its own for the capable and the strong, and this was still left to him. He, Orlando Brotherson, despair while his great work lay unfinished. That would be to lay stress on the inevitable pains and fears of commonplace humanity. He was not of that ilk. Intellect was his god, ambition his motive power. What would this casual blight upon his supreme contentment be to him, when with the wings of his air car spread, he should spurn the earth and soar into the heaven of fame simultaneously with his flight into the open? He could wait for that hour. He had measured the gulf before him and found it passable. Henceforth no looking back. Rising, he stood for a moment gazing, with an alert eye now, upon such sections of his car as had not yet been fitted into their places. Then he bent forward to his work, and soon the lips which had uttered that sardonic laugh a few minutes before parted in gentler fashion, and song took the place of curses, a ballad of love and fondest truth. But Orlando never knew what he sang. He had the gift and used it. Would his tones, however, have rung out with quite so mellow a sweetness had he seen the restless figure even then circling his retreat, with eyes darting accusation and arms lifted towards him in wild but impotent threat? Yes, I think they would, for he knew that the man who thus expressed his helplessness along with his convictions was no nearer the end he had set himself to attain than on the day he had first betrayed his suspicions. End of chapter 33.
Initials only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peak. Initials Only by Anna Katharine Green. Book 3, The Heart of Man. Chapter 34. The Hut Changes Its Name. That night Oswald was taken very ill. For 3 days his life hung in the balance. Then youth and healthy living triumphed over shock and bereavement, and he came slowly back to his sad and crippled existence. He had been conscious for a week or more of his surroundings and of his bitter sorrows as well, when one morning he asked Doris, whose face it was he had seen bending over him so often during the last week, "Have you a new doctor? A man with white hair and a comforting smile? Or have I dreamed this face? I have had so many fancies this might easily be one of them." "No, it's not a fancy," was the quiet reply, "nor is it the face of a doctor. It is that of friend. One whose heart is bound up in your recovery. One for whom you must live, Mr. Brotherson." "I don't know him, Doris. It's a strange face to me, and yet it is not altogether strange. Who is this man, and why should he care for me so deeply?" "Because you share one love and one grief. It is Edith's father whom you see at your bedside. He has helped to nurse you ever since you came down the second time." "Edith's father? Doris, it cannot be. Edith's father?" "Yes, Mr. Challoner has been in Derby for the last 2 weeks. He has only one interest now, to see you well again." "Why?" Doris caught the note of pain, if not suspicion, in this query, and smiled as she asked in turn, "Shall he answer that question himself? He is waiting to come in. Not to talk. You need not fear his talking. He's as quiet as any man I ever saw." The sick man closed his eyes, and Doris, watching, saw the flush rise to his emaciated cheek, then slowly fade away again to a pallor that frightened her. Had she injured where she would heal? Had she pressed too suddenly and too hard on the ever gaping wound in her invalid's breast? She gasped in terror at the thought. Then she faintly smiled, for his eyes had opened again, and showed a calm determination as he said, "I should like to see him. I should like him to answer the question I have just put you. I should rest easier and get well faster, or not get well at all." This latter he half whispered, and Doris, tripping from the room, may not have heard it, for her face showed no further shadow as she ushered in Mr. Challoner and closed the door behind him. She had looked forward to this moment for days. To Oswald, however, it was an unexpected excitement, and his voice trembled with something more than physical weakness as he greeted his visitor and thanked him for his attentions. "Doris says that you have shown me this kindness from the desire you have to see me well again, Mr. Challoner. Is this true?" "Very true. I cannot emphasize the fact too strongly." Oswald's eyes met his again, this time with great earnestness. "You must have serious reasons for feeling so, reasons which I do not quite understand. May I ask why you place such value upon a life which, if ever useful to itself or others, has lost, and lost forever, the one delight which gave it meaning?" It was for Mr. Challoner's voice to tremble now, as reaching out his hand he declared, with unmistakable feeling, "I have no son. I have no interest left in life outside this room and the possibilities it contains for me. Your attachment to my daughter has created a bond between us, Mr. Brotherson, which I sincerely hope to see recognized by you." Startled and deeply moved, the young man stretched out a shaking hand towards his visitor, with the feeble but exulting cry, "Then you do not blame me for her wretched and mysterious death? You hold me guiltless of the misery which nerved her despairing arm?" "Quite guiltless." Oswald's wan and pinched features took on a beautiful expression, and Mr. Challoner no longer wondered at his daughter's choice. "Thank God!" fell from the sick man's lips, and then there was a silence during which their two hands met. It was some minutes before either spoke, and then it was Oswald who said, "I must confide to you certain facts. I honored your daughter and realized her position fully. Our plight was never made in words, nor should I have presumed to advance any claim to her hand if I had not made good my expectations, Mr. Challoner. I meant to win both her regard and yours by acts, not words. I felt that I had a great deal to do, and I was prepared to work and wait. I loved her." He turned away his head, and the silence which filled up the gap united those two hearts as the old and young are seldom united. But when a little later Mr. Challoner rejoined Doris in her little sitting room, he nevertheless showed a perplexity she had hoped to see removed by this understanding with the younger Brotherson. The cause became apparent as soon as he spoke. "These brothers hold by each other," said he. "Oswald will hear nothing against Orlando. He says that he has redeemed his fault. He does not even protest that his brother's word is to be believed in this matter. He does not seem to think that necessary. He evidently regards Orlando's personality as speaking as truly and satisfactorily for itself as his own does, and I dared not undeceive him. He does not know all our reasons for distrust. He has heard nothing about the poor washerwoman." "No, and he must not for weeks. He has borne all that he can." "His confidence in his older brother is sublime. I do not share it, but I cannot help but respect him for it." It was warmly said, and Mr. Challoner could not forbear casting an anxious look at her upturned face. What he saw there made him turn away with a sigh. "This confidence has for me a very unhappy side," he remarked. "It shows me Oswald's thought. He who loved her best accepts the cruel verdict of an unreasoning public." Doris's large eyes burned with a weird light upon his face. "He has not had my dream," she murmured, with all the quiet of an unmoved conviction. Yet, as the days went by, even her manner changed towards the busy inventor. It was hardly possible for it not to. The high stand he took, the regard accorded him on every side, his talent, his conversation, which was an education in itself, and, above all, his absorption in a work daily advancing toward completion, removed him so insensibly and yet so decidedly from the hideous past of tragedy with which his name, if not his honor, was associated, that, unconsciously to herself, she gradually lost her icy air of repulsion and lent him a more or less attentive ear when he chose to join their small company of an evening. The result was that he turned so bright a side upon her that toleration merged from day to day into admiration, and memory lost itself in anticipation of the event which was to prove him a man of men, if not one of the world's greatest mechanical geniuses. Meanwhile Oswald was steadily improving in health, if not in spirits. He had taken his first walk without any unfavorable results, and Orlando decided from this that the time had come for an explanation of his device and his requirements in regard to it. Seated together in Oswald's room, He broached the subject thus: "Oswald, what is your idea about what I'm making up there?" "That it will be a success." "I know, but its character, its use, what do you think it is?" "I've an idea, but my idea don't fit the conditions." "How's that?" "The shed is too closely hemmed in. You haven't room." "For what?" "To start an aeroplane." "Yet it is certainly a device for flying." "I supposed so, but—" "It is an air car with a new and valuable idea. The idea for which the whole world has been seeking ever since the first aeroplane found its way up from the earth. My car needs no room to start in save that which it occupies. If it did, it would be but the modification of 100 others. Orlando!" As Oswald thus gave expression to his surprise, their two faces were a study, the fire of genius in the one, the light of sympathetic understanding in the other. "If this car, now within 3 days of its completion," Orlando proceeded, "does not rise from the oval of my hangar like a bird from its nest, and after a wide and circling flight descend again into the self-same spot without any swerving from its direct course, then I have failed in my endeavor and must take a back seat with the rest. But it will not fail. I'm certain of success, Oswald. All I want just now is a sympathetic helper, you, for instance. Someone who will aid me with the final fittings and hold his peace to all eternity if the impossible occurs and the thing proves a failure." "Have you such pride as that?" "Precisely." "So much that you cannot face failure?" "Not when attached to my name. You can see how I feel about that by the secrecy I have worked under. No other person living knows what I have just communicated to you. Every part shipped here came from different manufacturing firms. Sometimes a part of a part was all I allowed to be made in any one place. My fame, like my ship, must rise with one bound into the air, or it must never rise at all. It was not made for petty accomplishment or the slow plodding of commonplace minds. I must startle or remain obscure. That is why I chose this place for my venture, and you for my helper and associate." "You want me to ascend with you?" "Exactly." "At the end of 3 days?" "Yes." "Orlando, I cannot." "You cannot? Not strong enough yet? I'll wait then. 3 days more." "The time's too short. A month is scarcely sufficient. It would be folly, such as you never show, to trust a nerve so undermined as mine till time has restored its power. For an enterprise like this, you need a man of ready strength and resources, not one whose condition you might be obliged to consider at a very critical moment." Orlando, balked thus at the outset, showed his displeasure. "You do not do justice to your will. It is strong enough to carry you through anything." "It was." "You can force it to act for you." "I fear not, Orlando." "I counted on you, and you thwart me at the most critical moment of my life." Oswald smiled, his whole candid and generous nature bursting into view in one quick flash. "Perhaps," he assented. "But you will thank me when you realize my weakness. Another man must be found, quick, deft, secret, yet honorably alive to the importance of the occasion and your rights as a great original thinker and mechanician." "Do you know such a man?" "I don't, but there must be many such among our workmen." "There isn't one, and I haven't time to send to Brooklyn. I reckoned on you." "Can you wait a month?" "No." "A fortnight, then?" "No, not 10 days." Oswald looked surprised. He would like to have asked why such precipitation was necessary, but their tone in which this ultimatum was given was of that decisive character which admits of no argument. He therefore merely looked his query. But Orlando was not one to answer looks. Besides, he had no reply for the same importunate question urged by his own good sense. He knew that he must make the attempt upon which his future rested soon, and without risk of the sapping influence of lengthened suspense and weeks of waiting. He could hold on to those two demons leagued in attack against him for a definite 7 days, but not for an indeterminate time. If he were to be saved from folly, from himself, events must be rushed. He, therefore, repeated his no with increased vehemence, adding, as he marked the reproach in his brother's eye, "I cannot wait. The test must be made on Saturday evening next, whatever the conditions, whatever the weather. An air car, to be serviceable, must be ready to meet lightning and tempest, and what is worse perhaps, an insufficient crew." Then, rising, he exclaimed, with a determination that rendered him majestic, "If help is not forthcoming, I'll do it all myself. Nothing shall hold me back, nothing shall stop me, and when you see me and my car rise above the treetops, you'll feel that I have done what I could to make you forget." He did not need to continue. Oswald understood and flashed a grateful look his way before saying, "You will make the attempt at night?" "Certainly." "And on Saturday?" "I've said it." "I will run over in my mind the qualifications of such men as I know, and acquaint you with the result tomorrow. There are adjustments to be made. A man of accuracy is necessary. I will remember. And he must be likable. I can do nothing with a man with whom I'm not perfectly in accord." "I understand that." "Good night, then." A moment of hesitancy, then, "I wish not only yourself but Miss Scott to be present at this test. Prepare her for the spectacle, but not yet, not till within an hour or two of the occasion." And with a proud smile in which flashed a significance which startled Oswald, he gave a hurried nod and turned away. When in an hour afterwards Doris looked in through the open door, she found Oswald sitting with face buried in his hands, thinking so deeply that he did not hear her. He had sat like this, immovable and absorbed, ever since his brother had left him. End of chapter 34.
Book 3, Chapter 35 of Initials Only. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Carl, St. Louis, Missouri, January 2009. Initials Only by Anna Katharine Green. Book 3. The Heart of Man. Chapter 35. Silence and a Knock. Oswald did not succeed in finding a man to please Orlando. He suggested one person after another to the exacting inventor, but none were satisfactory to him, and each in turn was turned down. It is not every one we want to have share a world-wide triumph or an ignominious defeat. And the days were passing. He had said in a moment of elation, "I will do it alone," but he knew even then that he could not. 2 hands were necessary to start the car. Afterwards he might manage it alone. Descent was even possible, but to give the contrivance its first lift required a second mechanician. Where was he to find one to please him? And what was he to do if he did not? Conquer his prejudices against such men as he had seen, or delay the attempt, as Oswald had suggested, till he could get one of his old cronies on from New York? He could do neither. The obstinacy of his nature was such as to offer an invincible barrier against either suggestion. One alternative remained. He had heard of women aviators. If Doris could be induced to accompany him into the air instead of clinging sodden-like to the weight of Oswald's woe, then would the world behold a triumph which would dwarf the ecstasy of the bird's flight and rob the eagle of his kingly pride. But Doris barely endured him as yet, and the thought was not one to be considered for a moment. Yet what other course remained? He was brooding deeply on the subject in his hangar one evening. It was Thursday, and Saturday was but 2 days off, when there came a light knock at the door. This had never occurred before. He had given strict orders, backed by his brother's authority, that he was never to be intruded upon when in this place, and though he had sometimes encountered the prying eyes of the curious flashing from behind the trees encircling the hangar, his door had never been approached before, or his privacy encroached upon. He started then, when this low but penetrating sound struck across the turmoil of his thoughts, and cast one look in the direction from which it came. But he did not rise, or even change his position on his workman's stool. Then it came again,
Still low, but with an insistence which drew his brows together and made his hand fall from the wire he had been unconsciously holding through the mental debate which was absorbing him. Still he made no response, and the knocking continued. Should he ignore it entirely, start up his motor, and render himself oblivious to all other sounds? At every other point in his career he would have done this, but an unknown, and as yet unnamed, something had entered his heart during this fatal month, which made old ways impossible, and oblivion a thing he dared not court too recklessly. Should this be a summons from Doris? Should, inconceivable idea, yet it seized upon him relentlessly and would not yield for the asking. Should it be Doris herself? Taking advantage of a momentary cessation of the ceaseless tap-tap, he listened. Silence was never profounder than in this forest on that windless night. Earth and air seemed, to his strained ear, emptied of all sound. The clatter of his own steady, unhastened heartbeat was all that broke upon the stillness. He might be alone in the universe for all token of life beyond these walls, or so he was saying to himself, when sharp, quick, sinister, the knocking recommenced, demanding admission, insisting upon attention, drawing him against his own will to his feet, and finally, though he made more than one stand against it, to the very door. "Who's there?" he asked imperiously, and with some show of anger. No answer, but another quiet knock. "Speak, or go from my door. No one has the right to intrude here. What is your name and business?" Continued knocking, nothing more. With an outburst of wrath which made the hanger ring, Orlando lifted his fist to answer this appeal with his own fierce fashion from his own side of the door, but the impulse paused at fulfilment, and he let his arm fall again in a rush of self-hatred which it would have pained his worst enemy, even little Doris, to witness. As it reached his side, the knock came again. It was too much. With an oath, Orlando reached for his key, but before fitting it into the lock he cast a look behind him. The car was in plain sight, filling the central space from floor to roof. A single glance from a stranger's eye, and its principal secret would be a secret no longer. He must not run such a risk. Before he answered this call, he must drop the curtain he had rigged up against such emergencies as these. He had but to pull a cord, and a veil would fall before his treasure, concealing it as effectively as an Eastern bride is concealed behind her yashmak. Stepping to the wall, he drew that cord, then with an impatient sigh returned to the door. Another quiet but insistent knock greeted him, in no fury now, but with a vague sense of portent which gave an aspect of farewell to the one quick glance he cast about the well-known spot. He fitted the key in the lock and stood ready to turn it. "I ask again your name and your business," he shouted out in loud command. "Tell them, or—" He meant to say, "or I do not turn this key," but something withheld the threat. He knew that it would perish in the utterance, that he could not carry it out. He would have to open the door now, response or no response. "Speak!" was the word with which he finished his demand. A final knock. Pulling a pistol from his pocket with his left hand, he turned the key with his right. The door remained unopened. Stepping slowly back, he stared at its unpainted boards for a moment, then spoke up quietly, almost courteously. "Enter." But the command passed unheeded. The latch was not raised, and only the slightest tap was heard. With a bound he reached forward and pulled the door open. Then a great silence fell upon him, and a rigidity as of the grave seized and stiffened his powerful frame. The man confronting him from the darkness was Sweetwater. End of Book 3, Chapter 35.